The war in Europe had ended, but the conversations had only just begun. In quiet rooms across Germany, inside captured headquarters, Allied intelligence officers sat across tables from men who had commanded armies, divisions, and entire fronts. These were not propaganda interviews. They were professional soldiers speaking to other professionals, long after the fighting was over, when there was no longer anything left to gain by pride or deception. And again, a strange pattern emerged. German commanders spoke of the British with respect. They described them as steady, disciplined, and careful. They spoke of the Soviets with a kind of grim recognition, as relentless and brutal, willing to endure losses that would have broken any other army. But when the subject turned to the Americans, the tone changed. The words became sharper. Some said unpredictable. Others said aggressive. A few used a word that appeared repeatedly in the records: dangerous. Not because they were the most experienced, not because they were the most skilled, but because they seemed to change faster than anyone expected. This was not how the story had begun. In early 1943, few German officers believed the United States Army posed any serious threat. When American troops first arrived in North Africa, they looked inexperienced, awkward, and unprepared. The Wehrmacht had been fighting for years. They had defeated France in weeks, driven deep into the Soviet Union, and battled the British across the deserts of Libya and Egypt. Compared to that record, the Americans appeared almost amateurish. That belief seemed confirmed in February 1943 when American forces faced veteran German units in Tunisia. The battle that followed would become one of the most humiliating defeats in American military history. Units were scattered across mountains and valleys with little coordination. Communications were poor. Many soldiers had barely completed training. Some had never even fired their weapons in combat conditions. When German armor attacked, the result was chaos. Tanks were destroyed in isolated engagements. Infantry retreated without orders. Headquarters struggled to understand what was happening at the front. For German soldiers, the experience reinforced every assumption they had made. These newcomers from across the Atlantic were not professionals. They were civilians in uniform, and against seasoned European troops, they would collapse. But something happened in the final days of that battle that German officers did not fully understand at the time. The Americans did not simply withdraw and regroup. They began changing even while the battle was still unfolding. Artillery coordination improved. Units concentrated instead of scattering. Defensive positions hardened. The German advance slowed, then stalled. Among those who noticed this was the German commander leading the offensive, Erwin Rommel. He had expected to exploit the collapse and drive deep into Allied rear areas. Instead, he found an enemy that seemed to be learning in real time. He later noted that American troops recovered quickly after the initial shock and regrouped reserves to block key terrain. For a commander of his experience, this was deeply unsettling. The shock deepened in the weeks that followed. The American High Command reacted to the disaster with ruthless honesty. Commanders were replaced. Training methods were reviewed. Doctrines were rewritten. New leaders arrived who demanded discipline, coordination, and initiative. Among them was George S. Patton, whose arrival transformed the atmosphere almost overnight. Officers were ordered forward to lead from the front. Units trained relentlessly. Combined arms tactics, infantry, armor, artillery, and air support working together became the foundation of every operation. The result appeared within weeks. When German armored forces attacked again in Tunisia, expecting another easy victory, they encountered something entirely different. Minefields slowed their advance. Artillery fire arrived with terrifying precision. Tank destroyers struck from concealed positions. What had once been confusion became coordination. Within hours, the German assault stalled and then retreated. To German observers, this transformation was shocking. Armies did not change this quickly. European militaries evolved slowly, shaped by decades of tradition. Yet the Americans seemed to absorb failure and turn it into improvement at an astonishing speed. At the heart of this transformation was something invisible to most soldiers: a system. The American Army had developed centralized artillery coordination that allowed massive firepower to be directed with extraordinary speed. Forward observers could call for fire, and within minutes shells from dozens or even hundreds of guns could strike a single target. But the most terrifying aspect was timing. German troops described moments when everything was quiet, and then suddenly the ground exploded. This technique, known as time on target, meant shells arrived simultaneously. There was no warning, no time to take cover. German soldiers began to fear open ground, daylight movement, and any exposed position. The fear did not come only from artillery. Above the battlefield, the sky itself became an enemy. Fighter-bombers roamed constantly, searching for movement. Convoys that traveled by day were attacked. Tanks that advanced across open fields drew immediate strikes. German troops developed a grim saying for these aircraft, referring to sudden death from above. The scale of air superiority stunned German commanders. By 1944, Allied aircraft dominated the skies. German pilots faced overwhelming odds. Fuel shortages, training limitations, and constant losses eroded the Luftwaffe's effectiveness. Ground forces could not maneuver freely. Every movement became a risk. Yet technology alone did not explain the growing fear. In the summer of 1944, American forces faced a new crisis in Normandy. The countryside was divided by ancient hedgerows, forming natural fortresses. Tanks could not cross. Infantry advanced slowly and suffered heavy casualties. The advance stalled. For many armies, this would have meant months of planning and study, committees, reports, and debates. Instead, solutions emerged from the lowest ranks. Soldiers experimented in the field. Engineers improvised. Tank crews tested new methods. One simple idea, metal prongs welded to tanks to break through the hedges, spread rapidly. Within days, hundreds of vehicles were equipped. The breakthrough followed. This ability to encourage initiative at every level became one of the defining characteristics of American forces. German doctrine had once emphasized similar flexibility, but increasing control from higher command eroded it. Orders became rigid. Retreats were forbidden. Initiative was punished. Meanwhile, the Americans encouraged experimentation. Failure was not hidden but studied. Lessons spread across the entire army. This difference became even more evident during the winter of 1944, when Germany launched a massive counteroffensive in the Ardennes. The surprise attack initially shattered Allied lines. Units were cut off. Supplies were lost. Confusion reigned. Yet once again, the American response followed a familiar pattern. Defensive positions formed quickly. Small groups held critical terrain. Artillery created barriers of fire. Reinforcements moved with remarkable speed. At the crossroads town of Bastogne, surrounded American troops refused to surrender. Their resistance disrupted German plans and bought time. The refusal became legendary. Meanwhile, maneuver on a larger scale reshaped the battle. Forces redeployed across vast distances in days. Counterattacks struck vulnerable flanks. The offensive stalled. German commanders later admitted that the failure of their attack was not due to a single battle, but to the overall resilience of American forces. They absorbed shock, reorganized, and counterattacked with relentless pressure. Underlying all of this was something even more decisive: industry. The United States produced aircraft, tanks, trucks, and ammunition on a scale unmatched by any other nation. When equipment was lost, replacements arrived. When supplies ran low, more were produced. Logistics networks kept armies moving. For German soldiers, this was both impressive and demoralizing. Tactical success brought little advantage if the enemy could recover immediately. Over time, German officers began to understand that their initial assumptions had been wrong. The Americans were not amateurs in the sense they had imagined. They lacked long traditions, but they possessed something different: adaptability. The British were predictable and methodical. The Soviets were relentless and overwhelming. The Americans combined firepower, innovation, and speed of learning. This combination created uncertainty. German commanders could not anticipate how American forces would respond to setbacks. Every victory seemed temporary. Every breakthrough was met by counterattack. By the end of the war, the perception had reversed completely. Among those captured in 1945 was the veteran German commander Gerd von Rundstedt. When asked which Allied general impressed him most, he named George S. Patton. Such an answer would have seemed unthinkable just 2 years earlier. The transformation from defeat to feared opponent had occurred in less than 3 years. This story was not only about weapons or numbers. It was about how organizations respond to failure. The American Army did not hide its mistakes. It studied them. It encouraged initiative. It rewarded solutions rather than tradition. The lesson extended beyond the battlefield. Institutions that learn faster often defeat those that rely on experience alone. Adaptability can outweigh skill. Speed of improvement can overcome early weakness. German soldiers learned this lesson in the harshest possible way. They began the war confident in their superiority. They ended it wary of an opponent that grew stronger with every setback. And that is why, when the fighting ended and the interrogations began, so many of them used the same words. Not disciplined. Not relentless. But unpredictable. Aggressive. Dangerous. Because in the end, the most frightening enemy is not the one that starts strongest. It is the one that never stops learning.